Thank you, Sarah. So today I'm going to talk to you about a paper titled Fertility Patterns in the Context of Mexican Migration to the United States, Childbearing Before and After Migration. So the Mexican American population has experienced rapid growth over the past decade. So they grew from about 21 million in 2000 to 32 million in 2010. And this accounts for approximately 40% of the U.S. population growth, despite the fact that Mexican Americans constituted only 10% of the U.S. population in 2000. And of course, this accounts for approximately two-thirds of this increase of about 11 million or so. Two-thirds of it was driven by births. And because the fertility of Mexican Americans has really fueled the growth in population of both Mexican Americans as well as U.S. population overall, there's a resurgence of interest with regards to the fertility of women with origins in Mexico. Yet despite the strong interest, there's really a lack of consensus about the fertility of Mexican immigrants. There's a lack of consensus with regards to the fertility levels. And depending on what report you look at, the total fertility rate is estimated at 2.5 all the way to 3.1. And if you really think about it, this is a huge difference, right? Which is equivalent to about every other Mexican American or Mexican immigrant women having approximately one additional child during their reproductive years. There's also a lack of consensus about fertility changes over time, and I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this later. So today I'm going to ask two research questions. The first is, how does the fertility of Mexican immigrants change over time? And given the fact that most of the literature attribute the fertility differentials between individuals of Mexican origin and other groups to educational differences, I'm going to ask, to what extent are the fertility changes over time due to shifts in educational characteristics? So the way I'm going to go about answering these two questions is as follows. First, I'm going to tell you why it's important to study the fertility of immigrants, especially the fertility of Mexican immigrants in the United States. Then I'm going to provide you with a brief review of the theoretical background and empirical work that has been done that looks at fertility changes within and across generations. Then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my data and methods. This will be followed by a presentation of my results section, which is comprised of two parts. The first part looks at fertility changes over time, and this is both within and across generations. And then the second part looks at how educational disparities affect fertility changes over time. Then I'm going to talk to you about my limitations and conclude with a few remarks about the policy implications of this work. So why should we care about immigrant fertility? We should care about immigrant fertility because of two reasons. One is it has implications for future population size and composition. And as we know, because of a lot of the work that has been produced by members in this room, it's the case that immigrant fertility can really mitigate some of the problems that are arising due to population aging. And in the United States, this includes extending the solvency of the Social Security program. Also, the distinct reproductive rates and the resulting differences in growth rates can also affect the future population composition. That is, if a group is growing at a faster rate compared to others, they'll occupy a larger share of the future population. It also has implications for the socioeconomic mobility of immigrants. We know from the sociology of work, sociology of gender, and economics literature, and women's fertility have adverse effects for educational and occupational outcomes. That is to say, if a woman becomes pregnant at an unusually young age, then they may have to drop out of school. If they have a lot of children, then perhaps they may not be able to take the lucrative jobs that are both demanding in terms of time and commitment. We also know from the social stratification literature that citizenship size is negatively correlated with socioeconomic attainment because it dilutes the amount of family resources that an individual child can obtain. Therefore, high rates of fertility may have adverse effects on the ability of immigrants to become integrated into their host society. So today I'm going to focus on the fertility of Mexican immigrants in the United States. And this is because they're the largest contemporary immigrant group and they're perceived to have higher fertility rates than other groups. Yet, one thing that I wish to point out is that the methodological approach that I'm using in this paper can be used for any other immigrant group, including the Saudi Arabians in Ontario, or the Hmong in Minnesota, or the Cubans in Florida. So now onto the theoretical background. So as I mentioned earlier, there's really a lack of consensus on how the fertility of immigrants change and their descendants changes over time. And reflecting this lack of consensus, there's a lot of theoretical models that have been produced in order to explain how the fertility of immigrants changes over time. And so what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk to you about the 4 most commonly cited fertility theories. And the first 3 that I mentioned is about how migration influences changes in actual levels of fertility. The last one that I'm going to talk to you about is looks at the effects of migration on fertility timing. So let's start with the classical assimilation model. According to this model, the high fertility of Mexican immigrants are due to the pronatalist norms in Mexico. But once they come to the United States and they obtain greater exposure to the school system, and as a result, perhaps they find a more diverse working place, then they'll start adopting family norms from the destination country, which in this case is conducive to lower fertility rates. And as a result, their fertility will decrease over time with prolonged durations of stay in the United States. This is the trajectory of fertility change predicted by the classical assimilation model. An implicit assumption in this model is that Mexicans in Mexico have higher fertility rates than whites in the United States. And they enter the United States with high rates of fertility, but over time, their fertility decreases as they get greater exposure to the destination country. The next 2 theoretical models predict that the fertility of Mexican immigrants will remain high over time. They do so for different reasons. The segmented assimilation model argues that immigrants have diverse outcomes, which largely depending on the amount of resources that they bring from the sending community. And what this means in the context of Mexican migration to the United States is that Mexican immigrants are entering the United States with low levels of human capital, and as a result, they're destined towards downward assimilation. The few venues for upward mobility, in turn, reduces the opportunity costs associated with childbearing, and as a result, the fertility remains high, regardless of how much time they spend in the United States. The other model is the racial stratification model. This model argues that as non-whites, Mexicans face severe discrimination. This hampers their educational and other forms of socioeconomic mobility. The few venues for upward mobility, in turn, reduces the opportunity costs associated with childbearing, and as a result, their fertility remains high over time. The trajectories of fertility change predicted by the segmented assimilation and racial stratification model is presented in pink. Once again, this model assumes that Mexicans in Mexico have higher fertility rates than whites in the United States. Mexican immigrants enter the United States with high fertility, and their fertility remains high regardless of how much time they spend in the United States. This last model is a model about how migration influences fertility timing. And according to this model, immigrants disrupt their fertility in anticipation of the difficulties associated with the migration process itself. And what this means in the context of Mexican migration is that they may disrupt their fertility because they don't perhaps want to cross the border while they're pregnant, or they're in fear of raising a child during the very early initial settlement process. But once those difficulties are behind them, they'll compensate for the earlier disruption in fertility. And this is the trajectory of fertility change predicted by the disruption and catch-up model. Once again, this is about how migration influences fertility timing. It doesn't really tell you about the directionality of change in the actual levels of fertility. And you'll notice that during the migration process, immigrants disrupt their fertility, but once those difficulties are behind them, they'll compensate for the earlier disruption in fertility. Now onto empirical studies. Most studies that look at how the fertility of Mexican immigrants have changed over time have focused on generational differences. And notably scarce in this literature are studies that look at fertility changes within a generation, that is across the various stages of migration. And today there are 3 empirical studies that have looked at how the fertility of Mexican immigrants in the United States changes over prolonged durations of stay in the United States. But regardless of whether they're looking at generational differences or within generation differences, all the studies provide mixed accounts about fertility changes. Some say that the fertility of Mexican immigrants decreases over time, while others say they'll remain high regardless of the amount of time they spend in the United States. So I'm going to start with the study by Ford, because this was the first study that looked at fertility changes within a generation. An implicit assumption in this study is that Mexicans in Mexico have higher fertility than whites in the United States. And she finds that Mexicans enter the United States with high rates of fertility. After that, they disrupt their fertility. This is followed by a period of compensation or catch-up. But over prolonged durations of stay in the United States, their fertility decreases, converging towards the fertility of whites. This pattern is interpreted to be consistent with the classical assimilation and disruption and catch-up hypotheses. Yet, a key limitation of her study is that she doesn't have any data on the pre-migration fertility of individuals. It is all assumed. Therefore, she can't really tell if the fertility decline that she's observing is in fact the case, fertility decline itself, or it's that immigrants are experiencing the temporal effects of migration, and they're merely resuming their old fertility behavior from prior to the migration process. Another problem of this, another limitation of this paper is that they use census data. Therefore, she can't tell if the fertility decline, once again, is coming from the fertility decline itself, or they reflect fertility differences of individuals who arrived at different points in time, and therefore at a cross-section, they appear to have different durations of stay in the United States. The second study was conducted by Carter in 2000. And their major contribution is that they use retrospective histories. That is, she's able to observe aggregate patterns of change in the fertility of women within the lives of women. And what she finds is that the Mexican immigrants disrupt their fertility immediately following migration, but over prolonged durations of stay, their fertility decreases, converging with those of whites, of Mexican Americans. This pattern is interpreted as something consistent with classical assimilation and/or disruption and catch-up model. Yet a key limitation of her study is that she's using Mexican Americans as the proxy for mainstream United States. Yet the empirical literature is really mixed as to whether or not US-born Mexicans, their fertility is in fact converging towards those of whites. Yes?
When you say the assumed Mexicans, is fertility of women in general in Mexico, or those who ultimately migrate?
Right now, the way that the literature is written, they assume, although it's, you'll see later that it tends to be positively selected, the assumption is that there's no selectivity. Yes. And although this is not a limitation of our study, she uses event history analysis. Therefore, this allows us to compare the instantaneous hazards of giving birth and how they vary across different groups, but they cannot be easily converted to actual numbers, which is what you need in order to do future population projections. The third study was conducted by Frank and Huvelin in 2005, and their major contribution is that they try to incorporate the pre-migration fertility of individuals. And they do this by assuming that the national average in Mexico is in fact a proxy for the pre-migration fertility of individuals. What they find is that the fertility of Mexican immigrants immediately following their migration is a lot higher than the national average in Mexico. And although it decreases somewhat, it remains higher than both the national average in Mexico and those of whites in the United States. This pattern is interpreted to be consistent with the racial stratification model, that is to say that it's the discrimination that lowers the opportunity costs associated with childbearing, and as a result, results in higher fertility rates for Mexican immigrants in the United States than in Mexico. But this is probably a point that Noreen just raised. A limitation of this study is that they're using the national average in Mexico as a proxy to measure the fertility behavior of immigrants prior to the migration process. In the event that there is no selection, that is, the fertility behavior of immigrants is similar to that of the national average in Mexico, then their interpretation would not have problems. But if there is positive selection, that is to say that the fertility rates of immigrants are in fact higher than the national average, then their interpretation would not be right. There's also studies that look at fertility changes across generations. This body of work, too, provides mixed evidence. Some argue that the fertility of Mexican immigrants decreases across generations and converges with that of whites. Others, however, argue that the fertility of Mexican immigrants remains high across generations and does not converge with that of whites. Yet, despite the mixed accounts, one thing that is consistent across the different studies is that the fertility differences between individuals of Mexican descent and whites are attributed to educational disparities. So, when we look at the literature overall, there's really a lack of consensus about the levels of fertility as well as how the fertility changes over time. And this lack of consensus arises because of two reasons. First, studies have been unable to answer what are the actual levels of fertility for Mexican immigrants. And obtaining fertility rates seems like an easy enough task. You just divide the births occurring to women in a given period by the number of women in that particular period. Yet, this seemingly straightforward task is a little bit more complicated for the Mexican immigrant population. So you obtain the numerator, that is the births occurring to women at a certain age in a given period using vital statistics data. And this yields pretty accurate numbers of births, because if a birthing process involves a healthcare provider, and most births in the United States do, even those occurring to illegal immigrants, then a birth record gets produced, and then you get counted towards vital statistics data. Yet, obtaining accurate counts of the number of Mexican women at a certain age period in a given period is more complicated. You usually obtain this from the census data, and because Mexican immigrants are highly mobile, and a lot of them are undocumented, they try to avoid government agencies, including the Census Bureau. This results in an undercount in the number of women at a certain age in a given period, which in turn has a tendency to inflate the fertility rates of Mexican immigrants. And of course, the ability to obtain accurate counts of women differs by the years since their arrival and their generational status, because all of these things are tied to their ability to get proper documentation in the United States. The second unanswered question is, what is the pre-migration fertility of immigrants? Migration is really a process that has a before, during, and after. And ascertaining whether or not an immigrant group is able to assimilate in terms of fertility over time involves looking at whether or not the fertility behavior of immigrant women are moving away from their fertility behavior in the sending communities and converging towards the mainstream behavior in the receiving communities. Yet, often, information about the fertility behavior of immigrants prior to the migration process is missing. So you can't really accurately decipher the trajectory of fertility change for Mexican immigrants in the United States. So the contributions of this paper are twofold. First, I'm going to obtain better estimates of actual levels of fertility by using retrospective histories of birth. This will allow me to capture the births that are occurring to the women, to the sample women, and avoid the two data set problem. I'm also going to obtain better estimates of fertility changes over time by considering the fertility of immigrants prior to the migration process. Now onto data and methods. The data for this project come from two sets of national representative data sets. To capture the fertility behavior of non-migrants in Mexico, I used data from the Mexican Family Life Survey. And although this is a longitudinal data set consisting of two waves, I'm going to use mostly the retrospective histories that are in wave 1. Then for the remaining three groups, that is non-migrant, the whites, Mexican Americans, and Mexican immigrants, I'm going to pull the 1995, 2002, 2006/08 National Survey of Family of Growth. This data is ideally suited for the present analysis because of two reasons. The first is that they collected complete retrospective histories of birth, including the date and outcome of each pregnancy. The second is that they asked questions about the migration experiences. So the MexFLS asked individuals if they ever migrated to the United States. And the NSFG asked individuals the year they came to stay in the United States, if they were an immigrant. My analytic sample consists of women born between 1958 and 1987 that are in the following four groups. The first group is non-migrants in Mexico. The second group is first-generation Mexican immigrants. The third group is US-born Mexican Americans. And the last group is whites. And for those of you that are wondering why I picked women in the birth cohort of 1958 and 1987, those are the women for whom retrospective histories of birth are available in the MexFLS. I also exclude missing data and inconsistent dates. And all the sampling restrictions together yield a sample size of approximately 21,000 women. So for my analysis plan, I'm going to first ascertain how the fertility of Mexican immigrants changes over time. And this is both changes within and across generations. Then I'm going to measure the extent to which these fertility changes are due to shifts in aggregate levels of education. So to capture migration experiences for my analysis of fertility changes within a generation, I basically take the retrospective histories of birth of Mexican immigrant women, and I wanted to disaggregate them by 5 distinct stages of migration. So to capture the period before migration, I wanted to capture a stage when the fertility behavior of Mexican immigrants would have not been affected by the migration process itself. So, and for the process during migration, I wanted to capture a period where women would alter their behavior in anticipation of the difficulties associated with the migration process. Then I wanted to capture a period immediately following migration, where women would alter their fertility behavior because of the difficulties associated with the early initial settlement process. Then for the period after migration, I wanted to capture a period when they were in the process of adjustment and a period when they were adjusted. For my analysis on fertility changes across generations, I created a dummy variable that distinguishes between first and second or higher order generational status. So the method that I'm going to use for this paper is a variation of event history analysis. So what I do is I take the women in the 4 groups and take their retrospective histories and classify them according to the following 5 age categories: less than 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, 30 to 34, and 35 or above. For the population of Mexican immigrants, I further disaggregate the retrospective histories by the 5 stages of migration that I mentioned to you earlier. So for 3 groups, the non-migrants in Mexico, Mexican Americans, and whites, the unit of analysis is person age category, whereas for the Mexican immigrants, the unit of analysis is person age stage categories. So the statistical approach that I take is Poisson regression.
Do you have enough cases for you, because you had about 1,100 or so Mexican immigrants, and if you break it down by 6 times 4, do you have enough categories?
Yes, that's why I classified, you'll see later that I'm classifying each period in 7-year intervals, and I wanted to make sure that each fertility estimate was conducted when there were at least 50 observations. So the statistical method that I use is Poisson regression. So I'm going to predict the number of children that are born within the unit of observation. And because of the way that I've organized the data, and in conjunction with the offset command, I'm able to compute the person years in each observation. And then by dividing the predicted number of children born in that interval by the number of person years, I'm able to obtain the age-specific fertility rates. So today I'm going to talk to you about the cumulative fertility rates, which is in essence accumulates the age-specific fertility rates between the ages of 12 and 34. So the intuitive way to think about this is think about the number of births that women are having between the ages of 12 and 34. Yes?
So when you're looking at pre-migration fertility, that's presumably covering quite a long time span?
Yes.
I'm just thinking what happens given that Mexico's fertility rate has been dropping so rapidly over this period. In some cases, you may just be going back a few years, but in some cases, you may be going back 15, 20 years. Is that?
Yes. So there are 2 things that I'm doing. I'm controlling for birth cohort to account for some of the drastic drop, because there are quite a bit of, it went from 6 to about 2.2 right now. So that's one way of doing it. Also, for some individuals, it goes back quite a bit. I've tried to restrict the number of years it goes back once I take out the controls for birth cohort to about 10 years, and the analysis, the results are generally in the same direction. And because my outcome is age-specific fertility rates, I control for age, and all the models are weighted so that it can produce national representative fertility rates. So now onto the results section. So for the first part, I'm going to talk about document how the fertility changes over time, and paying special attention to before, during, and after migration. So first, I wanted to compare the fertility rate of immigrants before the migration had any effect in them. And an implicit assumption of this comparison is that 7 or more years back, it doesn't, to those of non-migrants, to determine whether or not migration was selective in terms of fertility. And you'll notice that the fertility of immigrants 7 or more years prior to migration is substantially higher than those of non-migrants in Mexico. And they're on average having about 1 more kid. And this result is not surprising given the fact that a lot of them come from rural areas. I wanted to then compare the results and situate it in terms of the literature. So I computed the national average in Mexico using my data, and which is, in essence, Frankenhuber-Lean's approach. And I compared the fertility rates of immigrants 7 or more years prior to the migration process with the national average in Mexico. And you'll notice that the fertility rates of Mexican immigrants are substantially higher than the national average in Mexico because of selectivity. And this is not surprising given the fact that 10% of the population born in Mexico are living in the United States, whereas 90% are still in Mexico. Now, I wanted to look at how the fertility of immigrants changed during the migration process. So in this slide, the question that I'm trying to answer is, do immigrants disrupt their fertility in anticipation of the migration process itself? So I'm going to compare the fertility of immigrants 7 or more years prior to the migration process with those in the period immediately preceding migration. And you'll notice that the fertility rates of immigrants in the period immediately preceding migration is lower than the fertility of immigrants 7 or more years prior to the migration process. So this result is consistent with the view that migrants do disrupt their fertility in anticipation of the difficulties associated with the migration process itself. I then wanted to know that, to examine whether or not, once those difficulties are behind them, whether or not immigrants compensate for the earlier disruption in fertility. So you'll notice that although there is a drop prior to the migration process, it seems to be the case that immigrants, in the period immediately following migration, they just seem to resume their old fertility. And by the way, this is the time when they have the highest fertility rates. So the results from here seem to suggest that migrants do not appear to catch up. They seem to kind of press the stop button and then disrupt their fertility. But once they migrate, they just resume their old fertility behavior without compensating for the drop in fertility due to the migration process.
So they do catch up, but they don't overcompensate.
So they resume their fertility, but they don't. The concept of catching up is in terms of the retroactive, yeah, in terms of the fertility loss. So I wanted to situate my results within the literature. And the two studies that were cited earlier that find tempo effects are Ford study and Carter study. So I'm going to compare the results of my study for this particular stage in the migration process with those of Ford and Carter. So there are two differences in the results that Ford found and my results. The first result is that it relates to the timing of the disruption process. Ford finds that the disruption occurs immediately after migration, whereas my study finds that it occurs immediately before migration. The other difference is that Ford finds evidence of catch-up in the subsequent period, but I find no evidence of a catch-up. And this differential is probably attributable to the fact that Ford uses census data and I use retrospective data. Next, I compare the results to Carter. And what I found was there's only one difference in Carter's results and my results. And it relates with the timing of the disruption. Carter, who also uses retrospective history data, she finds that the disruption occurs after the migration process. Yet, my study finds that it occurs before the migration process. And this probably has something to do with the timing that we're capturing in our different studies. So Carter only uses the 1995 NSFG. Although I also use the 1995 NSFG, I also include the 2002 and 2006/08 NSFGs. And so basically, I'm covering a period, the fertility behavior of women in a period after the U.S. decided to militarize the border, and therefore it became more taxing for women to cross the particular border. So women will be more likely to disrupt their fertility in anticipation of the difficulties associated with crossing rather than later on. So here I wanted to look at how the fertility of immigrants changed after the migration process. And here I'm going to look at both changes within and across generations. And what I find is that the fertility of immigrants after the migration process does decrease, with almost all the decrease occurring in the period immediately following migration and the subsequent period. This is consistent with the classical simulation models. So now I want to situate my entire set of results with those in the literature. You'll notice that the fertility estimates for immigrants are probably not as high as those that were assumed to be the fertility rates of Mexicans in Mexico, but they're certainly higher than the national average in Mexico. And although the studies that find temporal effects find disruption after migration, I'm finding disruption prior to the migration process, and this has probably something to do with the militarization of the border. And like Ford and Carter, I find evidence that the fertility of immigrants decreases over time, slowly converging towards those of whites. Now, onto the second part of my results. I want to look at to what extent educational disparities can explain fertility changes over time. So towards the left are the models, the cumulative fertility rates predicted without controls for education. To the right are the cumulative fertility rates predicted with controls for education. So I'm going to take the fertility of immigrants 7 or more years prior to the migration process, before migration would have had an effect on the fertility behavior. Then I'm going to take my cumulative fertility of immigrants 14 or more years after the migration process, which would be a time when they would have attained adjustment. The gap in cumulative fertility rate among immigrants 7 or more years prior to the migration process is they are 25% higher than the fertility of immigrants 14 or more years after the migration process without controls for education. With controls for education, this gap decreases to only 5%. So educational disparities seems to account for approximately 80% of fertility changes within a generation. So next, I'm going to ask the question, to what extent are the fertility changes across generations due to shifts in education? So I'm going to focus on the fertility behavior of first generation and second or higher generation Mexican immigrants. The fertility of first generation immigrants are 35% higher than the fertility of second or higher generation Mexicans without controls for education. Once you introduce controls for education, then the fertility of second or higher generation Mexicans are in fact 10% higher than those of first generation Mexicans. So now I want to talk a little bit about my limitations and some of the sensitivity tests that I did. A limitation of this study is that I'm pulling 4 data sets. So I'm limited in the number of controls that I can include in the analysis. It's also the case that I would have liked to observe more immediate periods before and after migration, but I'm kind of restricted due to sample constraints to the 7-year age interval. And lastly, because the NSFG only collected information about nativity status, I cannot further disaggregate second and higher generation, although I'm using the retrospective histories, this is really a cross-sectional data. I cannot look at biological generations. I can only look at hypothetical generations. Now into sensitivity tests. So a question that I get asked often relates to period effects, right? But because I already have controls for A, and I have controls for birth cohort, I can't enter controls for period. This is the classic age period cohort problem. So what I do is I take out the birth cohort and add controls for year. I also add controls for year of migration. Second thing is, in the stages of migration, although I can't look at periods that are smaller than 7 years, I can certainly look at periods that are greater than 7 years. So I use different intervals. And overall, the general results do not change. So now into the conclusions. So I posted 2 questions in the beginning of the talk. And the first one was, how does the fertility of Mexican immigrants change over time? The answer to this is, before migration, migrants have higher levels of fertility than non-migrants in Mexico. During migration process, it seems to be the case that migrants disrupt their fertility in anticipation of the difficulties associated with crossing the border, but they do not catch up subsequently. And after migration, fertility seems to decrease within and across generations, with most of the drop occurring in the period immediately following migration and the subsequent period. The second question that I posed was, to what extent are fertility changes over time due to modifications in aggregate levels of education? And it seems to be the case that most, if not all, the fertility change over time are due to modifications in education. Now, I'm going to conclude with a few remarks about the policy implications of this work. So in terms of future population size and composition, it doesn't seem like the impact of Mexican fertility will be as great as previously predicted, because to start with, they're not starting as high as a lot of people have said that it starts, and it seems to be decreasing over time, and Mexican immigrants seem to be assimilating to the norms in the United States. With regards to the socioeconomic mobility of immigrants, it seems to be the case that the results here call for greater investment on the educational attainment of Mexican immigrants and their descendants. This will not only have a direct effect, but it also have an indirect effect in that the improvements in education may further enhance the socioeconomic integration of immigrants by reducing their levels of fertility. And with that, I conclude my presentation.